Welcome. My name is Jose Melendez, Campaign Director for the Taxpayer Protection Project at TPPF, and today we're talking about taxpayer empowerment. Much of the property tax debate at the legislature traces back to waste and abuse at the local level. For years, lawmakers in Austin have passed tax relief measures intended to lower your burden, yet property tax bills continue to rise. Let's find out why. On that note, I'm delighted to introduce my guest, a champion for liberty, Representative Terri Leo-Wilson. Terri, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So before serving here in the State House, I think you have a very unique voice because you served in the State Board of Education, or the SBOE. Before we kick off into the subject matter, I'd love to learn more about your time in the SBOE.
Well, it was a great time. I was teaching at the time. I taught school for 38 years. My specialty is with special needs students. And so, I had access to all grade levels and reading instructional materials at all grade levels, and really becoming alarmed at the lack of content, educational content, and not following the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, which is our curriculum. And a textbook is a teacher's number one teaching tool. And then really being alarmed at some of the indoctrination. And so I tried to recruit other people to run, and nobody did. And so, I was just young and green and thought, well, I don't like the way my person is voting, so maybe I'll run. And I did.
So as a follow-up, I know that students having these high-quality instructional materials is very important to you. So on that note, you passed House Bill 100 during the regular session, which gets at prohibiting schools from using materials on the rejected list.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about, now that we finally have this law, have we reached a point in which we are confident on the textbooks that are being used, or is there more still left to do?
I think we are more confident because now we have an elected body once again looking at those materials, ensuring that all of the TEKS that a child must know in third grade in order to pass and get to fourth grade are contained in the books. But Thomas Jefferson said that, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. So whoever represents you, if they're not representing you, you need to pay attention to State Board of Education races, because that authority under HB 100 has been given back to elected officials. Previously, for 13 years, we had vendors self-certifying their materials with the Texas Education Agency. What vendor is going to ever say, my materials only have 20% of the TEKS? But that was in fact found true. And with a high-stakes test for accountability measures for both schools, teachers, and students, you want to make sure that 100% of the TEKS are in there. You also want to make sure that the textbooks conform to the law, that there's no critical race theory, that all of the things that we say, we're not going to have Common Core, we're going to teach reading by phonics. All of those things must be in there. And now we have an elected person that is accountable to the citizens that will be checking for those things, that if they don't, you can remove and put another board member in.
So shifting gears into our subject matter, local debt across Texas, in fact, local debt across all local jurisdictions in Texas is set to eclipse $500 billion, which is a mind-boggling number. Do you think there's a concern in terms of the size and sustainability of our local government debt? Are these concerns unfounded, or do you think there's more there?
No, they're very founded. And the number one complaint I think all of us as legislators get from citizens is property taxes. Mm-hmm. And I'm retired. I live under the same burden. Can I pay both insurance and can I pay both my property taxes, especially living on the coastline? And that is due to people raising your rates at the local level, increasing spending at the local level. And I think most citizens look to the legislature to help, but oftentimes they don't realize that it's those bond elections, that it's those certificates of obligation. It's all the things that your local government is doing, not your state government, that the state government's trying to step in and limit to that, but we don't set your rate, we don't collect your property taxes, we don't spend your property taxes. That is your local governments. And, bond elections are usually held in May, where a lot of the stakeholders, ISD employees, contractors that will actually benefit from the bond by getting a contract through, are the ones that really are active in trying to increase turnout in May. So possibly move those to November.
Do you think that there's other reforms there on bond elections? So I'm reminded of an example. Back in May of 2019, Cypher ISD, it's the third largest ISD in the state of Texas, had a nearly $2 billion bond package on the ballot, and it passed with less than 5% of registered voters.
Yes.
And that was right after a massive turnout election, which was November of 2018. It was Beto versus Cruz, and we had massive turnouts, unlike anything we've ever seen. But then just a few months later, we had less than 5% of registered voters showing up to the polls. So you mentioned November uniform election data. Is there other reforms there
Well, I
that we
think
need
we
to tackle?
passed, one a couple years ago that required ballot language to say this is a tax increase because the way they sell it to citizens, oh, this is not going to raise your taxes. Well, in the end, it does. And so that was one reform that I think is really important. We could up the not the quorum level, but the level of which is required to pass a bond beyond just a simple majority. We could do that measure. We also passed yesterday SB 10, which will lower the rate at which the entity, the taxing entity, has to come back to the voters and say, okay, our cap is 2%, our cap, some it'll be 1%, but we have to go back to the voters to ask. It's not that you can't increase their rates, but you have to ask them to increase their rates. And like with certificates of obligation, which are used more and more, they were intended for disasters. They were intended for emergencies. Well, now local taxing entities, an emergency is that the cost of construction is going up. That's not a true emergency. That's not, but we see more and more of certificates of obligation going out there that don't require any voter approval. So maybe we could make some changes there as well. We have to also work on our end to possibly, we get capping appraisals all the time. I know the Senate's not very favorable to that proposal and doesn't think that that is the way to do that. But the House has sent some measures over on that, on capping appraisals, because our complaint is that, well, okay, you fixed our rate, you lowered our rate, you did this or that with our rate, but then the appraisal district just ups the price of our home. So I think we have to look at both ends. I really do. I think we're to that point. As you know, I carry both the ban taxpayer-funded lobbying bill. I've also carried the eliminate property tax bill. And moving towards more of a consumption-based tax. So I just am very skeptical of seeing real relief without moving to a completely different kind of taxing system.
And you bring up a really good point. In terms of relief, I think the state legislature has done its job year after year in sending relief down to our local governments.
Right.
But seemingly before the ink is even dry, these local governments jack up the rate, pass another bond election, or what have you, go on spending sprees.
Right.
You mentioned a few reforms. Do you think there's other reforms that are going to come up to the forefront ahead of the 90th session?
I would like to, in the interim, really look at, there are cities and municipalities and counties that are doing it right. I would really like to look at how can we reward those that do it right. Can we look at regulations that we could suspend or exempt or something like that? I don't really know. I haven't really started looking at that yet. But a way to reward people and communities that are doing it right, that aren't just going crazy with local spending. That would be one thing that I really want to look at, is more of a incentive to those to do it right, rather than always kind of being a punishment type law. I do think another thing that we did this session as well is we created some more transparency on some elections where it's not just a newspaper notice. The taxpayer will actually get a notice of the hearings, which are also very low attendance, that they will also get a notice of the hearing in the mail. So if they're not paying attention to their local newspaper or publication, they can now get notified by mail of those hearings, of those discussions, because those are also really low turnout when they have a hearing to discuss these issues of raising rates.
So final question, you touched on this a bit here earlier, taxpayer-funded lobbying. So year after year, local governments spend millions and millions of dollars on hiring these contract lobbyists to go up there and to essentially, advocate against our values. Can you talk a little bit about the problem we're trying to solve here and why we need to ban this practice?
I think because they don't represent the local constituents anymore. They're representing who they're getting paid for or paid by. It's very easy. I have one county that uses a taxpayer-funded lobbyist and another that doesn't, and so I have two really differing viewpoints. And actually, the county that doesn't. It's very active in picking up the phone and calling me and telling me their concerns or on legislation or things that are going to affect their county. It doesn't limit anyone from lobbying at all. It's just those entities that use our taxpayer dollars and are not listening to what the taxpayers want. They're listening to the entity that hired them want. And those are two very different things most often.
And just a quick follow-up, you constantly hear from local officials that we are taking away their voice with this, by banning taxpayer-funded lobbying. How do you respond to those folks?
Well, there's nothing that prohibits them from hiring somebody to look at bills. There's nothing that they can't call my office and we'll search the bills. We can search by caption. We can search, what are all the bills of session that affect counties and work in cooperative, manner with those counties. That's always an option. And I think it's more effective, actually, when they do that because, these are the people that you go back home to. These are the people that you work with that, you want to do great things for your county as well. It's not that we don't want great things. We do. And I love passing those bills. But there's nothing that prohibits them from lobbying. But when they have a big conglomerate like TASB, then they advocate for things that, oftentimes parents don't want. If it was an individual school district, it might be very different because then they're closer to the people.
Well, a lot of times, you mentioned TASB, they come here to, send their lobbyists to testify against the very reforms we've talked about in this program.
Exactly.
Well, Representative Leo-Wilson, thank you for being a taxpayer champion, and thank you for joining the show.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.